Hello, I'd just like to give some of my thoughts here on the subject of our heritage as religious Satanists, because I think this is quite an important subject for us, and I know that as religious or theistic Satanists, you will probably have faced quite a lot of put downs from various quarters, you know, aside from, you know, people who would just have, you know, a traditional Christian background or monotheistic background. You'll have found people who call themselves Satanists to actually be putting you down, and you'll have found that you know, atheists will be telling you that, you know, you're foolish for believing in the devil and in demons. You'll have materialists telling you that, you know, you're stupid to believe in magic or anything other than hard science, and then you'll have had neo-pagans on the other hand, basically saying, well, you're just reverse Christians, what are you doing, you know. So I know that a lot of people will have faced those sort of things. And I think it would be very good for us to actually remember not just our own faith in Satan and the demons, but also the heritage that we do actually have. And so I'd like to just go through how I view that, because I think it is actually a very rich heritage. I know that when I declared myself a Satanist, I actually felt like I had come home in some sense and had really found my path. It was really finally an answer that answered to something very deep in me, and that thing which was deep in me was actually the experience of selfhood and the experience of the human predicament in a sense. And as I understood it and I felt it, and well, there was that, and there was also, of course, the very deep and long-lasting, when I think about it, going back a long way, the deep attraction to the devil. So all these things made sense to me, but to return to the idea of this core of selfhood which we have within us. Human beings are not a typical mammal, not a typical animal, really. And I think this core of self within us is something which we find troublesome, and we find it, but it's also creative. It can be brave, it can be foolish, it can deviate from things, it can negate things, it can do differently, it can imagine. This is our creative spark, and I believe that this is actually very deeply linked to Satan. You know, this isn't like a philosophy, this isn't just like a philosophical teaching or something. I actually believe that this actually comes from the being called Satan. And I think that this characteristic of human consciousness, this troublesomeness and this Promethean sort of gift, or this Pandora's box of human nature, this is, I think, why we love anti-heroes. It's why we really are drawn to the complicated characters in stories, rather than the simple heroes. And it's also why we're drawn to, you know, horror and to vampire myths and werewolves, because in many ways we ourselves are both monster and hero, and that's what we have in our core, and we see that, we understand it, Most people try to flee from it. Some people are overcome by it. But I think this is part of our nature. We are both the monster and the hero. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's an old film from, like, you know, the very late 60s. And it's a science fiction. And there's a scene in that where the sort of proto-human apes come to a realization of their capacity to use tools and of their capacity to think differently, really, and that's really a spark of their forward evolution. And in the film, the catalyst for that is this mysterious black obelisk, which appears presumably from aliens or what have you. And this is the start of the film. Now, for me, it's not a black obelisk. For me, it's Satan. It's the devil. Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that he's an alien, but this is the sort of this is how I view our God, as this basically a sort of a progenitor of our characteristically human consciousness. And so this, for me, is our first heritage as religious Satanists. It is the starting point. It is the induction of human consciousness, and that is something to be proud of. But that is, for me, it's obviously a religious conviction. It's a religious intuition, and this is what I think of as part of our heritage. It's where we get our divine, it's almost like our divine deviance. It's a capacity to go beyond. And I think that is satanic. So that I would view as our first heritage. And that goes back to our beginnings. Now, somewhat close to home, I actually believe that we also had a place within paganism, because pagans, or many pagan societies, that they could understand ambiguity and complexity and plurality, and the unresolved nature of the sacred. You know, these weren't spiritualities which were moralistic in the modern sense or in the monotheistic sense. And I think they could understand this sort of this plurality, this multivalency, and so our God had a place there, and I think he was a different character in different cultures, and he was a God amongst gods, or a God against the gods, as I heard Don Webb put it. He's a God of nature and also a God of the negation of nature, both, which reflects us. That's exactly how we are. That's the sort of animal we are, and that's the sort of God our God is. Now, even before we got to monotheism, I think this coexistence of our God and the other gods, I think it started to become eroded, and you can see points in history such as the blackening of Set or what have you in Egypt, where our God is basically relegated, yeah, but he comes through nevertheless. He always has to come through, you know. Even in the Egyptian mythologies, even after Set is demonized, he's still necessary, you know, and he's still the only God who can defeat the demon Apep, you know, the chaotic force of Apep. He's the only one who can actually overcome Apep, which allows the sun to rise again every morning. See, our God, although his place started to be relegated, or started to, as this sort of like moralism starts to creep into things, he's still there. He's still there. And so I do think that we have a pagan heritage as well. Our God may have been known by different names, but it's still the same being, and I think we can trace that. So that's an important heritage for me as well. A third heritage, I think, is the occult. I mean the what was known as the black arts has always been our domain, really. Not all of the symbolism and you know, the pious stories that that become collected around various aspects of magic, but the inheritance of working with spirits and entities and the other world, and with these powers of nature and powers beyond nature. So this is also part of our heritage. It's very much part of our heritage. You know, you can clean it up, you can put it into a Christianized form or an Islamic form or whatever you like, but we are actually very close to the real tradition of the occult, and I think we always will be. And not to forget that it was a Satanist, Aleister Crowley, who has actually done more than anyone else probably to bring occultism into the modern age. I mean, you know, so, quite a few of his followers will argue the point that no, he's not a Satanist, but yeah, I think he really was. I think that's actually very clear if you read into his central mission based on the Book of the Law. So I'd say yes, Crowley's ours too. That's another inheritance for us, another heritage. Now, in the monotheist era, then I think we kind of reach the furthest outward reach of our negative development, if you see what I mean. Because as our God became written out of mythologies and changed, he became free of those mythologies, and because he was a real being. Yeah, gods are not entirely dependent upon mythologies. That's part of how we relate to them. It's part of how we build relationships with them. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you know, they are made up of mythology. They're not. They're actual beings, and there's a very interesting. I think there's a very interesting process in terms of gods becoming free of our social myths around them, and in doing so, I think they become more self-realized in many ways, and our God is the epitome of that. Really, Satan is the epitome of that. But in any case, as we know, during the monotheist period, and for instance during Christianity, Satan appears to us in this classical form, which we're familiar with, and from where we take the name Satanism. And I actually think of this as, in many ways, the most noble and courageous period of the activities of our God. And it's part of why I'm proud to call myself a Satanist. You know, people will tell you, look, there weren't really Satanists like in the Middle Ages or what have you. You know, this was just hysterical witch hunters and what have you. And I'm quite certain there was a lot of hysteria and a lot of wild imagination and exaggeration on the part of witch hunters and on the part of gossiping neighbours and what have you. But amongst all these witch trials and all of the material written, was there really nothing real? Well, of course, it's very difficult to tell. There's very little hard evidence as such, but to say there was nothing there is, I think, overstating the case. And I honestly believe that even if not among the victims of the witch hunters, even if not among the victims, I'm quite certain that Satan was worshipped and honoured during this period. I'm quite certain of that. If you look at folklore, you'll find it abounds in references to the devil and devil figures. And near-pagans will say, well, these were pagan gods, you know, in disguise. And I'd say, well, yes, they are pagan figures in disguise, yeah? They are pagan figures, but they are also the devil. And for the common folk, they were the devil first and foremost. And I think you have to recognize that in pure folk terms, it's about the devil. And I think that's a fantastic thing, you know. We're not talking about a sociology of names here, you know. Was it the devil? Was it Kernunnos? Was it, you know, was it some other horned being? Were these nature spirits, you know? We are talking about a being, and I have a very clear sense and a very deep sense that the god of the witches was a real being and is a real being, and it's Satan, it's the devil. That's the simplest way of seeing it, yeah. And that's the only identity that actually fits all the associations and all the requirements of the religion of witchcraft, or of the practice of witchcraft, yeah. I think that's the one that really fits. It's the devil, and it's Satan. And honestly, I think this is wonderful for us as religious Satanists, because not only can we look back on this extraordinary time with pride that people had the courage to actually honor their love for our old God, but that also at this time, which is the absolute height of our denial and of the denial of our God, he yet appears as what is one of the most magnificent figures that was feared, desired, and witnessed. So this is an extraordinary thing, and the things associated with him: magic, heresy, sexuality, carnality, imagination, nature, miracles, gratification, freedom, and all this in opposition to a death cult of joyless morality and a severance from the pagan past. I mean, that's just amazing. This is something that would not die and could not die because he's real. And I think the thing to remember, and one of the reasons why I am not interested in interfaith and all this sort of it's all one business, yeah. One thing to remember is that monotheism is the real lie and the real anti-spiritual force, while Satan is our oldest friend and the great grandsire of our human consciousness. And that's the deep, deep link we have with him. That's the deep bond. He's in the DNA of our consciousness, and we have that deep, deep bond with him there. Yeah. Well, anyway, in conclusion, you know, our God, under whichever names, Set, Lucifer, Satan, Pan, the Horned One, is still with us. He's still with us, and he has been since the cradle of humanity's first stirring. His religion didn't begin in 1966 or even in the Christian era. And I've only to listen to the stories of actual believing Satanists to know that he has always called people directly and personally, because that's what he's still doing. I mean, forget about people reading the Satanic Bible or what have you. No, people who've never come across the Satanic Bible, who don't know about it, know very little about occultism, they have experiences of him and they get called to him. I think that's how it's always been. And these things don't get reported or given credibility in our modern age because it's cynical, it's image conscious, it's intellectually arrogant, and you can't go dealing with spirituality in this kind of a context. Yeah, it's a heresy. It's a heresy. You can talk about psychology, you can talk about politics, you can talk about sociology, and you can talk about academic understandings of history and academic understandings of pagan practices. Yeah, you can go into all those things, but spirituality, I'm sorry, no, that would be an embarrassment. And so that's why people don't pay attention to these things, and that's why it's so easy, I think, for religious Satanists to feel sort of put down, especially if they're young, because you've got all of these smart asses just with loud mouths who are going to tell you this, that, or the other and sneer. But don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You have a very long and rich heritage which spans from the beginnings of human consciousness right up to the present day, and you have nothing to be to feel embarrassed about. Yeah, you should feel proud of your faith and proud of having felt this kind of a calling. I mean, we've got the very long story, you know, like we've got the really long story going back all the way, and we have all those small personal stories in our own lives, you know, and I think that that this consciousness of the heritage helps to fill in some of that gap between the two. It helps to fill it in, but the other thing that actually fills it in is us working with each other to actually build our community and our religion, and I think that's really important. That is almost like that's the middle story. It's the good social story that we have to make ourselves, and we make that with love and work, just as anybody would do. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this little ramble, and thank you for listening.